Bag podcast. My name is Andre Gunawala, being joined by Ryan. And as you may have known, we've been talking about Russia and Ukraine for the past couple of weeks in our What in the World episode. So we thought we'd actually speak to someone who knows this issue very well. Ambassador Steven Pifer is joining us. The ambassador was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, with responsibilities for Russia and Ukraine between 2001 and 2004. He also served as ambassador to Ukraine between 1998 and 2000, and as special assistant to the president and senior director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia on the National Security Council. The ambassador is currently a non-resident senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe, Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, and Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Initiatives at the Brookings Institution, and he is seen as a widely respected commentator by many leading major outlets. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So Steve, again, thank you very much for joining us. Since we've talked a lot about Ukraine, I want to provide more context for all of our listeners, because they may not be very familiar with where Ukraine really is and the country, the history. And so in order to understand the state of Ukraine today, how far back do we really need to go? Is it Kyiv and Rus? Is it Khrushchev? Is it 91? Is it 2014? Where would you begin if you're providing an overview?
Well, I would start with Kyiv and Rus. This goes back 1,000 years, but it's important to understand the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine, because both Russia and Ukraine claim Kyiv and Rus as their founding state. So in Russia, they say Kyiv is the mother of all Russian cities. Now, you then have two countries where you have the culture, the language, the history is fairly intertwined. But I think the next really important date would be 1654, where Ukraine became part, or what we now call Ukraine, became part of the Russian Empire. And from 1654 up until 1991, with the exception of a couple of chaotic years in the aftermath of World War I, Ukraine was part of Russia's empire. However, in 1991, you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. In December of 1991, there was a referendum in Ukraine, and more than 90% of the population of Ukraine voted for independence. And that has been then that divergence. But I think one of the problems that Ukraine faces today is that of all the pieces that Russia lost when the Soviet Union collapsed and when the Russian Empire collapsed, the piece they miss most is Ukraine. And many Russians, first and foremost Vladimir Putin, have not yet reconciled themselves to the fact that Ukraine is and should be an independent and sovereign state.
So while Ukraine was within the Soviet Union, what did that dynamic actually look like? How did it sort of fit into the broader union? How were Ukrainians generally treated? What did that look like?
Well, I mean, Ukraine was, a major part of the industry of the Soviet Union. It was fairly well integrated. And indeed, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of the 1990s were sort of severing some of those collections, which no longer made sense. But it was integrated. But there was also, I think, still, the sense of Ukrainian national identity. And actually, it's fairly remarkable that over 1,000 years, when Ukraine as a state really has not existed as a Ukrainian state for much of that period, that this idea of Ukraine persisted. And you saw that really towards the end of the 1980s, where you began to see this independent movement revive within Ukraine. It was one of the republics that was pushing for more autonomy and later independence. And as I said, in 1991, then you had a very large vote by the population of Ukraine for independence.
So I want to talk a minute about demographics, because the Kremlin and Putin in particular talk about how Russians are basically in Ukraine, and that Ukraine is not a real country. It's this made up sort of entity, which is, in my view, and I think many people's views, a ridiculous view. But what is the demographic breakdown of Ukraine? Are there a lot of Russians living in Ukraine?
No.
Is there some sort of kind of, maybe aspect to this, that there's some truth in the sense that there are Russians living in Ukraine, or ethnic Russians?
Yeah, well, I'd separate the question out. I mean, there's a difference between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians, and those who speak Russian and those who speak Ukrainian, because there were, particularly in the 1990s, a number of ethnic Ukrainians who used Russian as their first language. And I'd guess when I was there in the late 1990s, probably 45% of the people spoke Russian as their first language. For most of the time, and certainly what I saw, Ukrainians on both sides, whoever, regardless of which language they used first, were very practical about the matter. And it was not unusual on the street to hear somebody ask a question in Ukrainian and the answer would come in Russian. So it's an issue that I think has been politicized, including by Mr. Putin, in ways that don't reflect the reality. But in terms of the demographic makeup, ethnic Ukrainians are by far the largest portion of the population. Before the seizure of Crimea and the conflict in Donbass broke out, probably about maybe 15 to 17% of the population of Ukraine was ethnic Russian. Now, Crimea was unique in the one sense is that it is the only region of Ukraine where ethnic Russians constituted the majority. They were probably about 60% of the population. But everywhere else within Ukraine, including in Eastern Ukraine, ethnic Ukrainians were in the majority, even though in Eastern Ukraine, probably a significant number of ethnic Ukrainians would use Russian as their first language.
So in that immediate period following the fall of the Soviet Union in 91, what was the actual relationship? What did it look like under under Yeltsin, basically? Yeah. What did it look like under Yeltsin between Ukraine and Russia pre-Putin during those 1990s?
No, there were certainly tensions between Moscow and Kyiv in the 1990s over issues like, well, first of all, the fate of the nuclear weapons. Ukraine inherited nearly 2,000 strategic nuclear warheads on its territory. There were disputes, for example, over division, not so much a division of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, but where that fleet would be based, because the Russians had the problem, they had, with agreement from the Ukrainians, most of the ships, but they didn't have facilities in Russia proper to home port the ships. So they needed facilities like in Sevastopol harbor in Ukraine. And there were disputes over that took 5 or 6 years to sort out. There were disputes over energy and trade. But the real factor, though, to bear in mind about Boris Yeltsin was, for all of his flaws, at the end of the day, Yeltsin accepted that Ukraine was a sovereign and independent state within the borders of 1991. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was agreement among all of the post-Soviet republics to accept those borders. And at that point in time, Crimea was part of Ukraine. And that's a big difference. I mean, Vladimir Putin doesn't accept that, but Yeltsin did. And even when there were times, for example, where people in the Russian parliament would make these outlandish claims to sovereignty or over Crimea or Sevastopol, Yeltsin would say, no, that is Ukrainian territory. And of course, Yeltsin was the one who in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 agreed to commit to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence.
It's always been very difficult for Ukraine to kind of move towards some sort of democracy. There's been kind of internal domestic political challenges from the early 2000s with the Orange Revolution up into the Maidan in 2013, 2014. And so what is domestic politics like? How would you kind of characterize the domestic politics of Ukraine? Is it really a democracy? Is it moving towards democracy? Is there rife corruption? How would you characterize it?
No, it's a mix. I mean, on the one hand, I think you've seen in Ukraine, and you haven't seen this elsewhere in the post-Soviet space, a really bottom-up push for democracy, for a political voice. You saw that in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, where hundreds of thousands took to the street to protest what was a blatantly stolen election, and actually succeeded in getting that election result reversed and having a new election held, which produced, I think, what was the democratic result. And then in the Maidan Revolution, it was originally a protest against then President Yanukovych's decision not to go forward with an agreement that would have linked the Ukrainian state with the European Union. And then it morphed really, though, into a broader protest against Yanukovych's trend towards authoritarianism. So you see in Ukraine this bottom-up push for democracy. And one of the things that I believe shows where the Ukrainians are when it comes to democracy, since 1991, Ukraine has held 6 presidential elections. And in those 6 presidential elections, 4 times the incumbent ran for re-election. In 3 of those 4 elections where the incumbent ran, the incumbent lost. You don't see that elsewhere in the post-Soviet space, with the exception of the Baltic states. So I think there's the habit now of free, fair, competitive elections, and that's good. Where I think Ukraine needs to do more is there still is a tendency of leaders, including maybe with President Zelensky now, to put more emphasis on personal political power as opposed to building institutions. Part of the problem is the outsized political and economic influence of oligarchs. That really needs to be contained. Corruption remains an issue. The judicial sector needs reform. There are too many judges who are either corrupt or compromised. And so there are still problems, but I think it's an environment where most Ukrainians, their desire is to be really normal Europeans, including with a democratic state, with a real political voice and reduce corruption. And the country's been making progress over 30 years, but probably not as much progress as Ukrainians would like to see or Ukraine's friends in the West would like to see.
So when understanding the political dynamics of Ukraine, what do pro-Russian elements look like within that political sort of institution? Do they exist? How sort of widespread are pro-Russian sentiments?
Yeah, no, I think certainly there were those in Ukraine who wanted to have good relations with Russia. But I think that's changed. When I was in the 1990s, I would say that there were some in Ukraine's West, very ardent Ukrainian nationalists who are strongly anti-Russian. But the bulk of the population was, either favorably inclined towards Russia or ambivalent about Russia. I believe that's changed in the last 7 years. And I remember, I go back to a comment a Ukrainian friend made to me some years ago, but after the Russian seizure of Crimea and then Russia's involvement in the military conflict in Donbass. And he said, Vladimir Putin has succeeded where centuries of Ukrainian nationalists have failed, is he's created a strong sense of Ukrainian national identity, and he's imbued it with a strong anti-Russian feeling. And I think it's going to take years, if not decades, to get past that. Now, I think Ukrainians still like individual Russians, but Ukraine's attitude towards the Russian state is markedly different over the last 30 years. And I think that's a result really of Russia's policy.
So let's discuss Russia's policy before we talk about other aspects of Ukraine. I think as many of our listeners are aware of, Russia annexed Crimea after illegally invading it and seizing it in 2014. They've also supported and invaded the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine with these kind of pseudo republics that are there now. Could you help us understand first how this kind of all played out? So we have this Maidan, and then what really materialized after that?
Yeah, well, the Maidan revolution, which began in November 2013, lasted until February of 2014. Now, the Maidan revolution, on the Maidan itself, and Maidan refers to Maidan Nezalezhnosti as Independence Square. And that was the center of the protests in downtown Kyiv. On the Maidan, the protests were largely peaceful. Now, a couple of blocks away on European Square, there were some outbreaks of clashes between the protesters and the police, but Maidan was largely peaceful. And then, though, there was basically the police authorities launched an attack on Maidan. There were shootings. About 100 protesters were killed. There's pretty clear evidence. I mean, there's video evidence of special police units firing into the crowd. And I think that then triggered really a crisis point. And you had the German, French, and Polish foreign ministers actually came to Kyiv to try to broker a solution between President Yanukovych and the protesters. And they did actually overnight, they worked out an agreement. My guess is they could not have sold that agreement to the protesters because it would have allowed Yanukovych to remain in the office of the presidency for another perhaps 9 to 10 months before there would be an early election. And I think that was unacceptable to the protesters, but they never really had the chance because Yanukovych signs the agreement, leaves the presidential administration, goes back to his dacha, packs up some things, and then just disappears. I mean, literally vanishes. No one knows where he is. And so the next day, Ukraine's Rada meets and they vote and they elect an acting president and an acting prime minister. Now, my guess is that they didn't check every constitutional box in that election, because the Ukrainian constitution said, well, this is what happens if the president dies. This is what happens if he's removed from office by a vote. But it doesn't say what do you do if he just disappears. And of course, about 6 or 7 days later, Yanukovych ends up in Russia. Now, so that's, you've got that government in place, and that government then begins to define, what's going to be our main foreign policy priority. And they say the first priority is going to be to sign the association agreement with the European Union that Mr. Yanukovych declined to sign back in November. And they make it very clear the number one foreign policy priority for the new government, the acting government, with support of the Rada, Ukraine's parliament, is to draw closer to Europe. And I think that caused panic in Moscow, above and beyond the panic when Yanukovych fled. And so I believe that the Russian military had long had a standing plan. What do you do about Crimea? And they invoked that plan and they moved to seize it. Bear in mind that under agreement with Ukraine, the Russian military already had 10 or 15,000 service personnel in Crimea for the Navy and support units and such. And so you already had that base there. And when the Russians, now, first of all, the Russians tried to disguise themselves. They were called by the Ukrainians little green men, people who were in Russian combat fatigues. They were clearly professional soldiers by the way they handled their weapons, but all of the identifying insignia had been removed. And so I think it was like a couple of days into this, Putin's asked by a reporter, are those Russian soldiers? He says, no, that's just a local defense militia. It has nothing to do with us. And the reporter says, well, Mr. President, they're wearing, Russian combat fatigues. And he says, well, you can get those in any army surplus store in the post-Soviet space. Now, 5 weeks later, Putin came out and said, well, yeah, they are Russian soldiers. In fact, he had their commanders to the Kremlin, where he gave them commendations, and the Russian Ministry of Defense actually produced a campaign medal, for the return of Crimea. So there was no doubt that the Russians were there, even though they were trying to disguise themselves early on. The Ukrainians chose not to oppose that time. So even though the Ukrainians had probably 10 or 12,000 military personnel in Crimea, they largely stayed in garrison. And I think there were 2 or 3 reasons for that. One was, my understanding was the government in Kyiv was saying, be very careful. If shooting starts, we want to make it very clear that the Russians fired first. Second, I believe that they were getting messages from the West, including from the United States. Be careful, don't do anything that might lead to an escalation of the crisis. And third, at the time, the Ukrainian military's practice was enlisted personnel served close to home. So most of the enlisted personnel in Crimea probably came from Crimea. And my guess is, and this is just a guess, but my guess is that Ukrainian commanders probably didn't have full confidence in how their troops would behave, if they were to decide to oppose the Russians. Now, it was very different, 6 weeks later when you had the conflict break out in Donbass, and it looked like a repetition. The Ukrainian government concluded, we can't let this go unopposed. And I believe had the Russians not been involved, that outbreak of what the Russians tried to portray as separatism would have been over in a matter of weeks and with very few casualties. But instead, the Russians got involved towards the middle of August of 2014. Actually, the Ukrainian military and security forces had almost re-secured the territory that the so-called separatists had taken. And then you had, regular units of the Russian army come in and just hammered them. And so you've got, the way I describe it, you've got really that part of Donbass that is now referred to by some as the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. They really are occupied by Russian and Russian proxy forces. And you've had, even though there have been sort of ceasefires, they've never been fully implemented. And in that conflict in Donbass, that's claimed probably more than 13,000 lives to date.
So, Ambassador, we've talked a bit about the Ukraine-Russia dynamic, but can you tell us a bit more about what U.S.-Ukraine relations have looked like in the post-Soviet period?
Yeah, U.S.-Ukrainian relations had normally been pretty positive. And it goes back to, in the early 1990s, I mentioned that Ukraine had on its territory 2,000 strategic warheads. Bear in mind, those weapons were designed, built, and deployed to strike the United States. And, largely at US behest, Ukraine agreed to give up those nuclear weapons. The warheads were transferred back to Russia where they were eliminated. And then through the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, the United States provided assistance for the elimination of the missiles and the bombers and the missile silos and other nuclear infrastructure in Ukraine. Part of the arrangement to persuade Ukraine to do that was the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. And in that agreement, which was signed in December 1994, after Ukraine had acceded to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state, but in the memorandum, the United States, Britain, and Russia committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, also committed not to use force or threaten use force against Ukraine, and committed not to use economic pressure on Ukraine. Now, all of those have been grossly violated by Russia in the last 7 years. One important note to make is that it's the Memorandum on Security Assurances, not guarantees. And this was a very important point for the United States, is we said we could not sign a document on security guarantees because a security guarantee is what a NATO member has. You know, if there's going to be an invasion of a Baltic state, there's an American commitment to provide military assistance, including American military power. And we are clear with the Ukrainians that we were not prepared in 1994 to make that level of commitment. Now, we did say we're going to take an interest in Ukraine. We will care and we will be there. But we also said the 82nd Airborne is not coming. And so that was that assurance. And so I think there's that kind of a check that we wrote to the Ukrainians back in 1994. At the time, we hoped they wouldn't have to cash it. I don't think the Ukrainians expected. I mean, again, this was a mistake made both in Washington and Kyiv, is that when we were talking about this, we weren't thinking of Vladimir Putin, we were thinking of Boris Yeltsin. And we didn't foresee what happened in 2014. You know, my guess is had Ukrainians really seen that prospect in 1994, they may have made different decisions about whether or not to retain nuclear weapons. But so I do feel that there is sort of that sense of commitment that we have to Ukraine. But also above and beyond that, there's a calculation, which I think is the right one, that if you have a stable and secure Ukraine, that also makes for a stable and secure Europe. And that's been an American goal going back to, you know, the end of World War II. So there has been that interest there. I think there's also another factor here beyond the interest in a stable and secure Europe, beyond, you know, the Ukrainians have been good partners over the last 30 years. And that is a Russia factor, which is, you know, what the Russians are doing now. I mean, this use of military force in Europe. I mean, Crimea was the largest land grab in Europe since the end of World War II. But that's unacceptable behavior in the 21st century. And there is a view that, you know, if Russia believes it can do that at minimal or low cost, are the Russians then tempted to use military force again? And might they be tempted to use it, for example, against a Baltic state? And I think that possibility is really, really low. But 10 years ago, I would have said the possibility was zero. And in the case of the Baltic states, we do have a military commitment to come to their defense. So I think a part of this is trying to make sure that the Russians don't think that they can pull this off. And so I think those are the number of factors which have led to fairly close engagement with Ukraine. When I was there, U.S. assistance levels to Ukraine were probably running $300 to $400 million a year. In terms of democracy, democratic reform, economic reform, we were very much involved in closing down the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, but also assistance in the Non-Lugar program to eliminate the missiles and the bombers that had been built to strike the United States. And you've had, I think, this fairly close relationship. There have been some bumps. But certainly in the aftermath of the Maidan revolution, there has been this inclination to be supportive of Ukraine and supportive of Ukraine's right as a sovereign state to choose its own foreign policy course. Something which, by the way, Moscow agreed to in the Helsinki Final Act back in 1975.
I mean, absolutely. History is certainly important when we're looking at the totality of the circumstances here. Ambassador, you mentioned NATO, and I want to bring up NATO because it is a point that Russia keeps returning to and a point that Vladimir Putin keeps looking to when trying to justify his actions. And so you did mention that Ukrainians are looking to Westernize and looking to democratize, but are they looking to join NATO? Are they looking to fully try to have these security guarantees? And if so, is there any validity to Russia's concerns about NATO encroachment?
Well, a couple of parts of that answer. One is, back in 2002, when NATO invited 7 countries to join, including the 3 Baltic states, Putin did not react badly to it. Part of the bad Russian reaction now, I believe, is not so much because of the geopolitics, but a lot of it is it's driven by domestic political calculations. And there's a sort of 2 factors here. One is, in contrast to his first 2 terms in president from 2000 to 2008, Putin can't base regime legitimacy on economics because the Russian economy is stagnant. So you've seen, since he came back to the presidency in 2012, it's been appeals to nationalism. Russia is a great power, Russia reasserting its place. And I think part of this is explained by that domestic factor. The other domestic factor that I think that's play here is a fear in Russia that if Ukraine succeeded, and here I'm talking about successful both in the democratic sense and also in the economic sense, but if Ukraine could begin to realize its economic potential, and you had a growing economy, rising living standards, and the sort of democratic progress they've made, the fear in the Kremlin is you Russians will start to say, why can't we have the same sort of democratic rights and the same political voice that they have in Ukraine? So a lot of this opposition to NATO, I think, is driven by domestic factors within Russia, which we really can't control for. But I guess I would make one other point, and that is, yes, Ukrainians have moved increasingly towards wanting to join NATO. And that's been a big change in the last 7 to 8 years. If you go back to 2012, polls show that maybe 20% of the Ukrainian population wanted to be in NATO. Today, polls show plurality, sometimes majorities. One even had 58% of Ukrainians saying Ukraine needs to be in NATO. President Zelensky, when he came to office back in 2019, he carried, I thought you'd describe it as an ambivalent attitude on Ukraine's place with NATO. Now he very much wants to see Ukraine in NATO. And I would argue that shift in the Ukrainian view towards Ukraine needs to be NATO, trace it back to what happened in 2014, the seizure of Crimea, the conflict in Donbass, 13,000 dead. I mean, this is a reflection of Russian policy. Nobody has done more to push Russia away, or push Ukraine away from Russia towards the West and towards institutions such as NATO than Vladimir Putin and this badly flawed policies he's pursued over the last 7 years. So the Russians may not like it, but the Russians really are at the heart of the reason why you have so much interest in Ukraine now in joining NATO, because they see that as essential to their ability to be a sovereign, stable, and independent state.
So when it comes to this particular situation we see now with the Ukraine and Russia, who's actually calling the shots in Russia? I mean, we talk about Putin all the time. Is it top down with Vladimir Putin, or is it more complicated? Like, who leads strategy, for example? What does the vertical of power actually look like?
Sure. Yeah, let me just make one more point on Ukraine, NATO, which is, and I think this is a point that's well understood within Russia now. And that is that there is no enthusiasm within NATO for putting Ukraine on a fast membership track. And that is because nobody knows what that means. If Ukraine joins NATO tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, does NATO find itself at war with Ukraine? Under Article 5, this idea an attack against one will be an attack against all. And the Russians understand that. But NATO, I think, is not prepared to close the open door and say that at some future point, Ukraine might expire to membership. So there's that complexity there, which again, I think is understood in Moscow, although their public statements don't reflect that. Now, who's calling the shots in Moscow? I think there's sometimes a tendency, and I'm sometimes guilty of it, to sort of say this is all Vladimir Putin. And I would say that Mr. Putin is the most powerful person to sit in the Kremlin since Joseph Stalin. And he doesn't have the same sort of checks that, say, Soviet leaders had from 1953 up until 1991. I mean, where there was a Politburo which had real authority. I mean, in 1964, the Politburo fired Nikita Khrushchev. There's no similar body like that in the Kremlin. But I think Putin does have to deal with an inner circle. He does have to deal with a group of folks who have power. But a lot of those people come from his background. They're Siloviki. They came out of the security services. So they have a worldview that's very similar to that of Mr. Putin, and their policy prescriptions are as similar to his. So, whether it's Putin or that inner circle, the policy here is coming really from the Kremlin. I point to the Kremlin because on major issues like this, for example, I talked to a European official earlier this year, and he basically said, when it comes to really essential issues about Russia, Ukraine, it's pointless to talk to the foreign ministry in Russia. They're not involved. They're not calling the shots. They just carry out policy. You really got to talk to the Kremlin because that's where the decisions are made. And I think that person was correct.
I mean, it's certainly interesting in understanding Russia's perspective on this. And so when we think about today, we have, we're reaching close to 200,000 Russian troops around Ukraine's borders. And that certainly is a security threat for Ukraine. And I've been thinking to myself, did Russia, one, set out what it sought to accomplish in 2014? Certainly the annexation of Crimea was very successful. The Donbass is a more complicated situation because the cost that Russia incurred may not kind of outweigh the benefits that it received. And so, one, is it important to separate Crimea and the Donbass situation as two separate campaigns? And then, and follow up to that, is Russia now maybe embarking on unfinished business?
Yeah. No, I see Crimea and Donbass in a different light. As I said earlier, Crimea was the one part of Ukraine in which ethnic Russians constituted the majority. And the takeover of Crimea, for the Russians, it was largely bloodless, which explains one of the reasons why it was hugely popular back in Russia. And it's very difficult for me to see analytically how Ukraine musters the political, the economic, the diplomatic, and the military leverage to get Crimea back. That's going to be hard. Now, having said that, that's an analytical judgment. The policy view I have is that the West should not recognize Crimea's illegal absorption into Russia. We should maintain sanctions on that. And we know how to do that. We did that in the case of the Baltic states for almost 5 decades. Donbass seems to me to be different in that the Russians did not move quickly to try to annex it. And it's almost as if the Kremlin looks at Donbass as a mechanism. It's a tool that they can use to put pressure on the government in Kyiv, to distract it, to destabilize it, to make it harder for the Ukrainian government to do what it needs in terms of internal reform. And so they've kind of sustained this simmering conflict. They can ratchet it up, they can ratchet it down. And we've seen that do that over the past 7 years, while really not being prepared, short of Ukrainian acceptance of really unacceptable demands by the Russians. They're not prepared at this point to restore Donbass to Ukrainian sovereignty. There's one other factor here is that after 7 years of conflict, your infrastructure in Donbass has been badly destroyed. The industrial plants have been hit. Rehabilitating that place is going to cost tens of billions of dollars. And my guess is Moscow doesn't want to fit that bill. So I think those are how they look at those two pieces. What you're seeing now, though, is different. My understanding is it's not yet 200,000 troops. I think the U.S. intelligence community reportedly expects that at some point in January, there's a plan to put up to 175,000 troops. But what you're seeing now is worrisome. I mean, first of all, some of these troops were deployed back in April and never went home. Some of these units come from as far away as Siberia. I think one unit's now out in the field is 4,000 kilometers from its normal garrison. So that does raise questions. What does Kremlin plan to do with this large military force? And I think you can see a spectrum. On the one hand, is this a bluff? Is this just to rattle Kyiv to make the West nervous? Or does the Kremlin plan, a major military assault, a new major military assault on Ukraine? That's a pretty broad spectrum. I have to say that up until about maybe 5 or 6 days ago, I tended towards thinking it was like, well, let me say, I'm not sure Vladimir Putin has decided yet. But my own view was that at the end of the day, he would probably not opt for a major military assault because of the costs in terms of Western sanctions, Western military assistance to Ukraine. I think sparking a further NATO buildup in areas close to Russia, because if there's a major military operation against Ukraine, countries in the Baltic region, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, they're going to understandably be more nervous, and they're going to want more NATO presence on their territories. But the big cost, I believe, would be the cost imposed by the Ukrainian military, which is far better than it was in 2014. Now, having said that, I would also say that in the past, I've not been the best predictor of Vladimir Putin's logic. And I'm much more pessimistic now than I was 5 days ago. And that's largely triggered by the substance of these two draft treaties that the Russian Foreign Ministry published. They published a draft NATO-Russia agreement and a draft US-Russia treaty. And those things are really packed with language and provisions that are unacceptable to the United States and NATO, and that the Russians undoubtedly understood would be unacceptable. There are a few workable bits in there, but just the massive unacceptable provisions, plus the way in which they were publicized. My understanding is they were given to US officials on Wednesday or Thursday, and almost immediately then publicized. That's not how you do a serious negotiation. And then if you look at the language coming out of Moscow, from Vladimir Putin himself down to senior ministry and defense officials, senior foreign ministry officials, there really is this very demanding nature about this call by the Russians for what guarantees, which is ironic. I mean, Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Russia has the most powerful conventional military in Europe. Russia has its troops uninvited and unwanted on the territories of Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And now Russia is asking for security guarantees for Russia. Okay, it's a little bit ironic there. But the language that's being used leads me to worry that the Russians do not intend these documents as a serious negotiating bid, but in fact, they're actually seeking a rejection by the West. And that would add to a list of fictional pretexts that they would put together to justify military action. I hope I'm wrong there. And I look at the documents and I say, look, if the Russians are serious and this is an opening bid, there are some pieces in there that the West could probably work with and respond to, provided the Russians were prepared to address reciprocal American and NATO concerns. But certainly the tenor of the language coming out of Moscow the last week is worrisome.
So, Ambassador, say that you are wrong about Putin, wanting to invade or not wanting to invade, and say like he actually does invade. You mentioned that Ukraine's military capabilities are much better than they were before. Could you sort of flesh that a bit out?
Sure.
What would, say, an offensive actually look like if it were to happen? And is Ukraine much better prepared to handle an offensive?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, again, Mr. Putin likes to have options. And so the Russian military has options. One would be to grab a bit more territory around the Donbass, but some have suggested, much broader options. One would be to seize the strip of land that goes from occupied Donbass down to Crimea. And that would allow the Russians to have a land route to Crimea, in addition to the bridge that they've built over the last several years that links Crimea to the Russian mainland over the Kerch Strait. Some have suggested that they might try to grab the canal that flows from the Dnieper River down to Crimea. Crimea is actually quite arid. And while there's enough water in Crimea for the population, there's not enough to support agriculture and industry. And one of the things that the Ukrainians did meant that they shut down the canal that provided a large amount of water to Crimea. The Ukrainians taking the very logical view that under international law, Russia has occupied Crimea. It is up to now, Russia has the obligation to provide for the needs of the civilian population. So there's been some suggest that the Russians might try to take that. And then some have suggested the Russians might try to really grab, maybe 40% of Ukraine, all that part of Ukraine that lies east of the Dnieper River. So it could be a minor operation, but it could be quite major. And we don't know. And as I said, maybe at this point, Mr. Putin doesn't know what he wants to do. But looks like the Russians are building the capabilities to be able to conduct a major high-end operation. Now, on the other hand, what they're going to face in Ukraine is a military that's more than twice the size of what it was in 2014. In 2014, the Ukrainians said they had really about 6,000 troops that were combat capable. Today, the Ukrainian military has tens of thousands of troops who have spent time on the line of contact opposite Russian and Russian proxy forces. They're much more experienced, they're better trained, they're better equipped. By all appearances, they appear to be quite motivated. And also in the last couple of weeks, Ukraine has been talking about territorial defense. They have territorial defense units, and there may be as many as 300,000 or 400,000 veterans who have served in the military in the last 7 years, who also have now military training. And they're talking quite openly about, we will provide, weapons to these people. And the idea being that, if the Russian military succeeds in the force-on-force conflict, the Russians may well find themselves having to deal with a partisan conflict. And there was an interesting poll, a poll that I think should be worrisome to the Kremlin, that came out, I guess, late last week, and it showed that of those asked in Ukraine, about 1/3, including 1/4 of those asked who lived in eastern Ukraine, said that they would be prepared to take up arms and fight the Russians if the Russians invade. And that has to, I think, figure on the Russian calculation. At the end of the day, the Russian military can beat the Ukrainian military, but it could come, I believe, and it would come at significant cost to the Russians. And they might find themselves in something of a quagmire if they try to grab a large chunk of territory, or they then find themselves having to contend with a guerrilla operation. And this, to my mind, maybe, again, I'm not sure I'm the smartest person to look into Vladimir Putin's mind, but if you go back and look at 2014, the seizure of Crimea was wildly popular because from the perspective of the Russian military, it was bloodless. The Donbass campaign has been portrayed by the Kremlin as these are just Ukrainian separatists with a few Russian volunteers. And the Russians go to great lengths to hide the fact that Russian military personnel have been killed in Ukraine. I mean, burials at night. There are anecdotes about families being told, "We're returning your son's remains. He was killed in Donbass, but the cover story is he was killed, in a training accident." I've heard one story, and this is third hand, but I've heard it from somebody who knew somebody, that somebody who lost their leg fighting in Donbass, Russian army, has basically been told, if you publicize that, you will lose your pension. Now, so there's been that effort, but if there's a conflict now, there's no way the Kremlin will be able to hide the fact that those who are dying are the sons and the husbands and the brothers of Russians. And I'm not sure how that plays in Moscow. Well, Crimea was popular. Polls show that Donbass is not so popular with Russians. And if you have even a bigger operation and you have lots of Russian soldiers coming home, what the Russians call Cargo 200, these are soldiers killed in action. I'm not sure that is something that the Kremlin is going to welcome.
So really, the higher the cost for Russia, the better for Ukraine and the West to ensure that we have deterrence. And so what can the United States and really our partners, it's really crucial for Germany, France, our other partners, Baltic partners, to come together and try to come to some sort of solution or deterrent structure. And what do you think is the best approach in order to increase these costs?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing I think and in fact, the White House has already indicated this, is that, they anticipate that if there's Russian military action against Ukraine, countries such as the Baltic states, NATO members, other NATOs like Poland, others in Central Eastern Europe are going to say, we want more NATO military presence on our territory because we can no longer be confident that the Russians might not try something. And the White House has already basically said that the United States would be prepared to respond positively to that. The Russians will not like more NATO infrastructure and NATO military presence next to them, but the Russians may in fact invite that if they go into Ukraine. A second thing, and this would probably not be done as a NATO as an organization, but you will see individual NATO members, the United States, Britain, Poland, Lithuania, and others provide, I think, more and different kinds of military assistance to Ukraine. It's pretty clear NATO is not going to send combat forces to fight Russians in Ukraine, but there's a pretty strong view among a number of NATO members, and particularly in Washington, that the West should provide assistance to help the Ukrainians better defend themselves. And so you've seen, like in the last couple of years, the provision of Javelin anti-armor weapons, which are reportedly quite effective against tanks and such. But there might be an expansion of that and maybe even different types of aid to fill in the niches that would allow the Ukrainian military to defend itself better. A third thing then would be sanctions, economic sanctions, at least the way they're described by the White House. They say that these are sanctions that would have far more economic pain for Russia than sanctions in the past. Now, people who know more about sanctions than I do say if you look at a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the most painful sanctions, right now the cumulative sanctions on Russia are probably somewhere between a 3 and a 4. So there's still a lot of, and those sanctions, by some estimates, cost the Russian economy maybe 1% of gross domestic product. But there are other sanctions. You could target other state-owned enterprises. You could target other sectors of the Russian economy. There have been some limitations put on Russia holding the Russian debt. If basically everybody in the West was told you can no longer hold Russian debt, all of a sudden, that debt gets dumped and it becomes very, very difficult, if not impossible, for the Russian government to borrow on international markets. I would say that the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, which has now been completed but not yet certified, I would believe that if there's a Russian invasion, that becomes a debt issue for a long time to come. If the Germans don't kill it, my guess is that the Biden administration in the future would no longer wage sanctions on the pipeline, which could have the effect of killing it. So you have that. So I think there are these, and then there's the talk of booting the Russians out of the SWIFT system for international bank transfers. Now that probably does, what that would do is usually complicate Russian companies' ability to conduct international trade, to make international payments and such. So there are lots of things that could be quite disruptive of the Russian economy. And apparently there have already been conversations between American and European Union officials as to the kind of sanctions that would be applied. What hasn't happened as far as we know, and what I think would be very useful would be if the United States and Europe could now come up with, and listen, these are the sanctions, and then privately convey that list to the Kremlin and say, just so you know, if you go into Ukraine, this is what will happen. And if that's a painful enough list, maybe that helps affect the Russian calculation. Sanctions by themselves are not going to prevent a Russian attack on Ukraine, but they could be one of several factors that might help tip the balance. And it's unfortunate, at least as I understand, we haven't yet reached that point where we could use sanctions more as a deterrent. But I do believe even if we don't reach that point, if the Russians do go into Ukraine, they will see very extensive and very painful economic sanctions. And there may be additional sanctions applied to individuals, not asset freezes, visa bans, things like that. I personally would like to see the visa bans expanded to include immediate families. I mean, an oligarch can't travel to the West, that's one thing, but let him have to explain to his spouse why she can't make her annual trip to London to go shopping at Harrods. There are things that we can do to turn up the pain, and we should be looking to apply as many of these instruments and making sure the Russians understand those instruments, because we're trying to affect that calculation. We're trying to make, at the end of the day, that Putin and his inner circle decide that a Russian military incursion into Ukraine would have more costs than benefits.
So, Ambassador, as we're hearing about this issue more and more in the news, we've seen some commentary and so on by many pundits from across the political spectrum. Why should Americans be caring about this issue?
Yeah. Again, you have to. I spent 3 years in Ukraine. I have a certain fondness for the country. I think there's several reasons. Again, one is Ukraine has been a very good partner of the United States over the past 30 years on issues that mattered a lot to Washington. One I've already mentioned, which is Ukraine's desire to get rid of 2,000 nuclear weapons that were built to incinerate American cities. Two was other times if you go back to 2003, 2004, after the US military operation against Iraq, the Pentagon was looking for other countries to contribute forces for the stabilization force. Ukraine had no dog in that fight, but for about 2 years, the fourth largest contingent after the Americans, the British, and the Poles was a Ukrainian force. And they were only there because of the US Ukrainian partnership. And so I think that merits some consideration on our part. The second reason, again, I say is that if you have an unstable, weak, faltering Ukraine, that's going to make it harder to have a more stable and secure Europe. That has an impact there. And again, the third point gets back to, are we prepared to let Russia get away with these kind of activities? My concern being that the Russians get away with it and calculate that the costs are sufficiently low or that they're manageable costs. Are the Russians then emboldened to try the same tactics elsewhere? And again, possibly against a Baltic state, a member of NATO, where we do have an obligation to go to war in their defense.
Well, those are all certainly important for all of our listeners. I mean, and I imagine everyone wants to learn more about this. And so, Ambassador, other than your fantastic book, The Eagle and the Trident, which was published not that recently, but recently enough to provide enough context on U.S. Ukrainian relations and your experiences there, what other resources should we all look to?
Well, there's a lot of commentary coming out. I mean, Brookings published information. In addition to me at Brookings, I'm also a William Perry Fellow at Stanford, which is now my main affiliation. But we have Ambassador Mike McCall there, who writes a lot about Russia and Ukraine. He, of course, served both on the National Security Council under President Obama, and then he was the U.S. Ambassador to Moscow up until 2014. You've also got at the Atlantic Council, their Eurasia Center puts out a lot of information on Ukraine. They have a specific Ukraine alert. So there's quite a bit of information out there that for people who want to sort of learn the history. There's also some good history. Sergei Plokhy has written a book called The Gates of Europe, which is a history of Ukraine, and it's very readable, but it gives you all the background that one might need about Ukraine. So I think there's lots of sources out there. And again, to understand, there's a lot of complexities here. There's a lot going on. I'm not sure we yet understand, what motivated the Russians to crank up the pressure at this point in time. Some people speculate that Putin has begun to think about legacy. And historically, how do Russian leaders how do they gain the title of great in history? It's because they acquire land. So is he trying to reacquire some land? I don't know. Another person has speculated that Putin is acting now because he fears that Ukraine is almost irretrievably lost from Russia. Well, again, my argument or my response to that is, that's been because of Russian policy of the last 7 years. And if the Kremlin now thinks invading Ukraine is somehow going to persuade the Ukrainians to look back fondly at Moscow, I mean, that's just doubling down on a horrendous mistake. So I'm not sure we understand the calculation here. And as I said, I've not been the best predictor of Mr. Putin's logic or his actions.
On that note, Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us here today. Your expertise is really very well informing for many of us who are not as aware of the issue that's been going on right now. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And I wish I could have presented a slightly more optimistic picture of what's going on now. Hopefully, optimism will prevail and we'll find a way out of this.